It's really we have a interesting Gemaras. Gonna need some concentration. We're on Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph by the two dots, a little more than halfway down. Mahu Machzor Mois. So we're talking in the Mishnah about someone who made a mistake. Reuven sold karka to Shimon. So Reuven was the seller, and Shimon was the buyer. Kuf Dalet Amud Aleph, yeah. And Reuven messed up. He added in. He said, "I'm selling you my field." He said, "This field is a base core, which is 30 saw, and it turns out it's more than that." So we said the purchaser, Shimon, has to pay him for the extra karka. And the Mishnah had said that's if it's more than a quarter of a saw per a quarter of a kav per saw, or 1/24th. Quarter of a kav per saw, which is 1/24th. So if it's that amount, if that's how much extra Reuven sold to Shimon, then Shimon has to pay Reuven and take it from him. We say, the Mishnah says, that the Meicher has the decision to make. It's his option. This extra land that he included in the sale, Reuven can say either, you know what, you have to pay me for this land. I have no use for it. I can't take a little stub of land for myself. It's useless to me. It's just a couple of kavin, couple of saw. But if he wants, he could take the land. It's the option of the seller to decide. The seller has the upper hand. So we don't say that the lekech has the option to say, I want to buy this extra land. Here's the money, give it to me. In fact, the Tanya, piches shivas kaven umechzelakur. If when Reuven sold the land to Shimon, he made the amount that he sold was 7.5 kaven less than what they had agreed on. Now again, a core is 30 saw. Each saw is 6 kaven. So 7.5 kaven equals 15. That's 7.5 kaven is equal to 1/4 of a kav. 1/4 times 7.5 equals 30. That comes out to 1/4 of a kav per saw. So that's the amount that we had said. That's the amount that we had just discussed in the Mishnah. About the maximum amount that he's allowed to be off before the purchaser has to pay for the extra karka he got. So picha shiva kavim mechzel kore, haisha shiva kavim mechzel kore. Higiyai. If it's that amount, then the seller is Michael, and then the buyer is Michael. Everyone overlooks it. Yoisemikam, but if it's more than that amount, which equals to the amount that we said of 1/4 of a kav per saw, we force the seller to sell the extra piece of land to the purchaser. And we force the buyer to buy it. So the Gemara is mashma that if either of them, we say it's not just that we force the buyer, we force Shimon to buy from Reuven, whether he wants or not. We also will force the seller to sell it to the buyer. The buyer is not interested in having this guy with a little piece of land right next to him. It's much more useful to him. It's that out of his alikasa. What are you gaining out of having this little piece of land? So this brisa seems to say that it's not just liyafis kaicha shamaycha. It's not just the seller who has the upper hand, but either of them can force the sale of this extra stub of land. And the Gemara, no, that's not when we say kaifanis shamaycha limkar. It doesn't mean that we force the seller to sell that piece of land even if he doesn't want it. It's going to have yakira meikara v'zal hashta. We're talking about where at the time that they agreed to make the sale, the land was going for $10 or so. And now, at the time when the sale actually went through, when he handed her over the karka, it was now $5 for a saw. Now, Shimon is saying, you're cramming down on me. You're saying I have to buy this extra, 8 kavim that are more than the minimum amount, that's more than the maximum amount that is inclusive in this deal. This is above the limit of what we say people are Michael. So you're saying now I have to buy it because it's useless to you to have just 8 kavim. I don't want to pay the price per kav that we had originally agreed to. I want to pay the current price. You're forcing me to buy it. So that's what it's saying. No. He could say kaifnes amaycha limkar doesn't mean that we force him to sell it whether he wants to or not. It means if the meicher wants to sell it, he has to sell it at the current lower price. That's what we say. We mean kaifnes amaycha limkar. I always say we have a price that says exactly the opposite way around. We say that if the purchaser buys that land, he pays it according to the current price. He pays according to the original price, not according to the current price. No, that's talking about a case where it was originally cheaper, where it was originally $5 for a saw, and now it's $10 for a saw. So whenever the meicher is forcing the lekech to buy this extra piece of land because it exceeds the limits that a person is meichel, then we say it's the meicher's option to decide if he wants to keep that land or if he wants to sell it to lekech. But once he sells it to lekech, the lekech gets to take the price, the lower of the price, whether it was a lower price when they agreed to the deal or the lower price of now. So that's what about where it was cheaper in the beginning. So then the purchaser could tell him, Shimon could tell him, I want to go with the original price. Okay. The Mishnah had continued. We said, okay, so this is, I know it's a little mathematical, but we had said in the Mishnah, right, that if the price, if the amount of karka exceeded what was agreed upon by more than a quarter of a kav per saw, which comes out to 7.5 kavim for a base core, which is 30 saw, then if it exceeds that, then the meicher has the option to say to the lekech, you buy this extra piece of land. I'm not meichel it, and you have to pay for it. But the Mishnah continued and said, if the amount of extra land is 9 kav, so we had touched it in the Mishnah, that means that at that point, that piece of land is big enough piece of land that the seller really could benefit from it. At that point, he loses his right to tell the purchaser, you have to take this land because it's useless to me. 9 kavim of land is really a full field that the seller can use it. So he has no justification for forcing the purchaser to buy it. So that's what the Mishnah said. Shemshire besad the base test kav. Amr Rav Huna. Rav Huna has a slightly different interpretation of this. He says test kav she'amru va'afilu bebeka g'dayla. He says that it doesn't mean that we apply the general rule that of a quarter of a kav for every saw. If you have that, if there's that much overage, if there's that much extra land that was sold to him, that's when the seller can force the purchaser to buy it. What's saying is, what the Mishnah then says is, but if it's tes kavin, even if it's a huge field, it has 2 base core, 3 base core. So, like we said, the amount of roiva hakav for a saw comes out to 7.5 kavin for 1 core. So obviously for 2 core base core it would be 15. He says no, once it's over 9, then that's already a significant amount, and at that point the seller can say, listen, that I wasn't ready to be mindful. So he's saying that the rule of a quarter of a kav per saw is limited by an absolute ceiling of 9 kavim. Once you get to an amount of 9 kavim over, that point it's too large of a discrepancy, and no matter how big the field was, it becomes like it's not a ratio anymore. At that point, it becomes an absolute determination that it's too much for the seller to be meichel, and the buyer is going to have to pay for it. But as we said, at that point, the meicher is not going to have any more the option. The seller, the leikech can say you can keep it because it's a full size field. So you could just say, I'm not interested in taking this field. You keep it for yourself. That's Rav Huna. Rav Nachman says the way we had originally explained the Mishnah. Doesn't make a difference how big the overage is. It could be, if it's 4 base core, then it would be 7.5 times 4 would be 30. It would come out to 30 kavim. And even 30 kavim, as long as it's that same proportion, we'll say that the meicher is going to accept it. However, if it goes above Tisha Kavin, at that point, the seller can no longer force the purchaser to buy it. He's relegated to only getting money back, because the purchaser can tell him, Shimon can tell him, listen, you have a full-size field, it's more than 10 kavim. So Rashbam goes, what the result of this mathematically is just a very narrow band where this rule that we say that it goes proportionately, because it's only up to basically a base core. I mean, the truth is anything under a base core. Anything under a base core, anything that's going to be essentially over a base core of 1.2 base core, it's always going to be whatever is above the proportion amount is also going to be above the test kavim. And therefore, the rule is going to be that the meicher cannot cram down on the leikech that he has to purchase it. But anyway, that's just an observation. The main point is that Rav Nachman says that we do go with a proportionate amount, even if it's ending up being more than 9 kavim. The seller is willing to be meichel. It could be 100 kavim, but as long as it's less than a quarter of a kav per saw, he's meichel, because he looks at it proportionally. If I'm selling a huge field, even if it's 10, even if it's 100 kavim, it's related in relationship to how much I'm selling. It's not significant. Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman. Rava asked Rav Nachman, Shem Shaya Besada the base Tisha Kavim. We said in the Mishnah that if he left over in the Sada base Tisha Kavim, Lav the Zavan Lake Kurayim, is that not talking about even where he sold him 2 core? That seems to indicate, like Rav Huna, that it's a absolute limit on how much a person is willing to accept. So we're like the Zavan Lake core. It's talking about that cap is talking about only where he sold him a core, but if he sold him 2 kurim, then the absolute limit, then the limit would be 15. It doesn't go based on 9 kavim. It goes on a proportionate amount of how much he sold. Magina, we said base chatzi kav. We said by Yagina, the cap is a chatzi kav. Agina is a vegetable garden. So a smaller amount is more chashiv, because you use vegetable gardens are obviously much smaller than a sada. So even a chatzi kav is that limit. So Lloyd is on the side. It's not talking about where he sold him 1 sa, it's talking about even where he sold him 2 sa. Lav the Zavan Leisa is not even talking about where he sold him 2 sa. Lloyd the Zavan Leisa. According to Kiva, base roiva, he says the maximum of that a person is willing to forgive by that is a chashav amount by a garden is a base roiva. My lav the Zavan Leisa, Lloyd the Zavan Leichatzi sa. Boy Ravashi. Ravashi asked the question, saw the Benasis Gina. All these questions were saying that there's an absolute cap of how much a person is willing to accept. They're starting at 1:45. Yeah. So, Boy Ravashi, saw the Benasis Gina. Gina Manasa Sadamai. What happens if it's switched? We said there's different absolute amounts. What happens if it started as a sada and then he decided to use it as a gina? So a gina, we said, is a machlokes of whether he only has to have a saw or chatzi saw, but it's much smaller than the 9 kavim, which is a saw is 6 kavim and a chatzi saw is 3 kavim. It's much smaller than the shear of a sada. Or if it switched the other way around, became a sada, what's going to be the amount that the meicher can no longer force the seller, the purchaser, to take the piece of land? Take it. Gemara says that's a good question. We don't have an answer. If the seller has his own karka that's right near the sada that he's selling. So now, if there's a stub of land that he gave that he sold that was extra, so he doesn't have an excuse to say, I don't want to take it because it's too small, because you could just add it on to the rest of his land. I feel kolshu, even if it's just a little bit above the 7.5 kavim, machzule kar. At that point, the seller, the purchaser, can say, take back your karka. You can't force me to buy it from you because it's not a stub. You can add it to your land. What happens if he has a bar? That's if the seller has a bar that's in between his bigger piece of land and this stub of land that the purchaser is trying to send back to him. What if he has an irrigation ditch, which is even a little bit more mafsik? If you say that a bar is not enough. What if you say that both the bar and Emisamayim is not enough, but he has a full-fledged road going in between the two of them? Richva de dikla. Or if he has a hedge that makes it's impossible to get from one to the other. Take. Umar says all these are take. We had these questions before in a different context a few laterally. Umar says he doesn't just return the quarter of a kav, but he does whatever was extra. It's backwards. It's not just that he only returns the riva and also the extra. The extra is even more certain that he has to return. It's really the other way around. It's saying not he doesn't just return the additional above the quarter of a kav, but even all the quarter of a kavs that would have normally been disregarded. Once he has extra, the quarter of a kav also gets returned. Okay, we'll stop over here.